You know, I drove up to Riverdale on Monday to drop my son off in this beautiful, bucolic little neighborhood in Riverdale where there's a yeshiva, there's a Jewish day school, and on the way back after I had heard that while I was dropping him off, that in the morning, around that time and also in the evening before, some vandals had come to four synagogues in the Riverdale area and had thrown, or at least one vandal that we know of had thrown stones and then desecrated the synagogues. And I heard about this. And as I went back to Riverdale to pick up my son after school, it's like the first time in 13 months that he had been in school. It was a beautiful day. The sun was shining. You could see the river from where I had dropped him off. There were children praying in the fields. Hearing on my way back to New York about the anti-Semitic incidents, I prepared myself then to go pick up my son. And as I was driving to pick him up, I saw the increased police presence in the synagogues along the West Side Highway and then also at his school. All of a sudden, there were police cars everywhere. And my son Tal picked up on this, and as he entered the car, he said, Abba, why are there all these police around here now? And I'm sure all of you, I mean, looking at you guys here, I'm sure all of you as parents know that these are very difficult questions to answer. You know, what do I tell him? Is it possible to shelter him from the truth of a messy world? Is it possible on a beatific, perfect day where he celebrated returning to school, he bounded out of the car, his yarmulke was almost falling off of his head, he made his way, and I was crying, something that we had waited for 13 months. Was it possible in the wake of that to say something that would acknowledge the messiness of the world that we live in, that would acknowledge the shadows that are also part of the light? And so I wondered and thought to myself what I could possibly say about the increased presence around his school and along the highway as we went back to New York City, back to Manhattan. This Shabbat, of course, tonight, is the day after Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the 49 days counting up to Shavuot. The 33rd day, the word Lag is Lamed Gimel 33. Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of a 49-day journey towards Revelation. That historically was connected by the rabbis with a significant event. It was the end of a plague, apparently, or something like that. Students of Rabbi Akiva, this great sage of the first century in Palestine, apparently he had students, 12,000 pairs that died, and the Talmud says that they died because of a magefa, because of a plague. We know historically that that's probably not true. It had more to do with the fact that Rabbi Akiva was very much a part of the revolt against the occupying forces of Rome, believing that a certain individual named Bar Kokhba, Bar Koziba, this particular person was going to herald in the new political sovereignty for the Commonwealth. He supported and backed the wrong horse, as it were. Rabbi Akiva's students, probably historians say, died not from a magifa, not from a plague that came about because they weren't honoring one another, but probably because they were part of a revolt that failed. And so this day, though, marks, the Talmud says, the end of that magifa, the end of that plague. On the 33rd day of the Omer, says the Talmud, the students stopped dying. And that day became a joyous celebration. It meant that the previous 33 days that had a valence of mourning would be lifted. It became customary for those who would not cut their hair during the first 33 days because of mourning to cut their hair on Lag BaOmer, to have their hair cut on that day, as if to say, no more mourning. Later on, the day became associated with a student of Rabbi Akiva's named Shimon Bar Yochai. Shimon Bar Yochai. Shimon Bar Yochai, we're told by the tradition, was someone, a very special mystic, someone to whom Torah was revealed, someone who brought down, says the tradition, the holy book of the Zohar, the most important mystical work in the Jewish tradition. The tradition attributes it to Shimon Bar Yochai, and the story around it is magnificent. Those of you who have never studied the story, it appears in Tractate Shabbat, in the Talmudic discussions about Shabbat and the seventh day of the week and the importance of the seventh day of the week. In the beginning of that tractate, in the beginning of that book, there is a folktale, a legend told about this Shimon Bar Yochai, known as Rashbi. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rashbi is someone who doesn't like the Romans. And in a conversation amongst friends, the Talmud relates a legend that he began to deprecate them. He began to say things about the occupying forces. They haven't done anything good for our culture, for our society. Everything they did for themselves, says Shimon Bar Yochai. Would that we were rid of them. And word gets back to the Romans, and the authorities come looking for Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Elazar. And as the legend has it, as it's told in that Talmudic conversation, Shimon Bar Yochai and Rabbi Elazar, his son, are on the run. And they run away from the authorities. And they hide, of course, in a cave. And the Talmud then says, miraculously, this father and son duo, they live in the cave. And everything is done for them. It's a miracle cave. There's a little stream of water that gives them fresh water. There's a carob tree that miraculously sprouts out of nowhere. And the Talmud says they're talking heads. They literally sit in sand up to their neck, says the Talmud, talking in Torah, talking in spirituality and kind of delight of God. At the end of this 12-year period, the story says that the herald came to tell Shimon Bar Yochai, Rashbi and his son, that the Romans are no longer looking for you. It's okay for you to leave your cave. And so Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Elazar leave the cave, and they come across someone who is working in a field. He's plowing and seeding and irrigating, doing the work of the land. And Shimon Bar Yochai, Rashbi, says to his son, is it possible that someone could spend their life working in a field when there is divine service and mystical unity? There's bliss. They're trading in bliss for a tractor, right? They paved paradise and they put up a parking lot. Really? That's what you're doing? Oskin b'chaye sha'ah. The details, the messiness of life, dirt under their fingernails, sweat on their brow. Rashbi and his son are incredulous. We're in the cave. We come out of the cave like Plato's cave, right? We come out and it's all shadows. This is what you're dealing with. This is enlightenment. This is what it is to be a human being. This is the sublime. And the Talmud records that everywhere they put their eyes, everywhere they looked, they burned. Their gaze became a destructive gaze. Their judgment, their cynicism, their sarcasm, their disappointment, their frustration, their utopic vision not materialized, they became destructive. And a voice comes out of heaven and says to them, La'achrivit olami yetzatem, did you come out of your cave to destroy my world? Is that what you learned in the cave? Go back. And so the Talmud recounts, the legend has it that they went back for a year. And at the end of the year, once more, they're given a second chance. They come out of the cave and they're walking along and they see an old man running. The Talmud makes a point of saying he was old and he was running. Kamirahet. He was running. He had a skip in his step and he was holding 2 myrtle branches. And so the dynamic cave duo, Rashbi and his son, look to this older man and they say, "Excuse me, my friend, what are you doing?" He says, I'm doing a mitzvah. I'm out doing a good deed, a commandment, a spiritual practice." And they say, "What is it?" He says, "Well, I'm bringing these myrtle branches." And they say, "Oh, wow. But wouldn't one be enough?" He says, "No. I need two of them. One is for remember and one is for observe. One is for the positive pole of Shabbat and one is for the negative. The two that are one, and they get it. They get it. They understand that the world is messy. They understand that perfect utopic visions must meet reality, that we can't stay in our caves imagining that there's no risk in leaving. We can't remain in our caves imagining that it doesn't matter how we leave it, how we leave the cave, because it matters how you leave the cave and what world you expect to find. There's no way to eliminate the risk of losing what you've gained in your cave. But when you come out to build the world, knowing that it is messy, that it is imperfect, that it is full of shadows, that there's no way to be completely and totally secure and safe. The world invites us to take the risk of living and to know it deeply. So we began with the priestly blessing. Maybe some of you recognize it, maybe some of you didn't. It's one of the oldest prayer in our tradition, recited by a unique group that served in the temple called the priests, and they blessed the people with these words. And I chose it because, of course, in our tradition, tomorrow morning is the reading of Parshat Emor, which begins with a commandment to the priests to be careful not to become defiled to the dead and not to come into contact with a corpse. But that commandment in tomorrow morning's Torah reading will immediately be subverted by exceptions to that rule. All priests, the Torah will say, Emor la kohanim b'nei Aaron lenefesh lo yitama be'amav. Don't come into contact with death. But you are to come into contact with death for the 7 relatives, those who are close to you. In other words, there's no perfect world, priests. Ensconced in your temple, we tried to say you can't come into contact with death, and that's true. But is it possible really to live in the world in the most rarefied sense, in the most pristine, blissful, ashramic experience, or maybe even in the sheltered in place experience of being in your home without knowing that the world is a messy place, that there will not be any guarantee? Your father, your mother, your brother, your sisters, the ones who you just called yesterday, it could be that they were in a group that went to Meron, that went to a small village in the north of Israel to honor the legacy of the Rashbi, to honor his death on the 33rd day of the Omer, and 100,000 of them yearning, all of them, to come out of their caves, to connect with one another, to celebrate the life of a mystic who saw through, to hold both the inside and the outside, the cave and the field. And in that moment, the shock of a messy world and the absolute incomprehensibility of it, the absolute sense that in so many ways, I am not saying that there aren't quote unquote accidents that are preventable. I'm not saying that the world is a messy place and so people should walk around without masks on and people should just give up on all of the things that we can do. But I am saying is like Rashbi leaving the cave with his son and seeing those who were working in the fields with the messiness. And his first experience was, no, I'm not getting messy. God's world is in the cave. And God says, no, my world is outside, even with the mess, even with the risk, even with the sense that you might come into contact and will come into contact with life, and it won't be controllable, and it's messy. Even so. And so the Torah says tomorrow, dedicate your life, priest, to the holy. but there's nowhere to run from life. Life will come. Messiness is there. It doesn't all fit neatly in a box. That's the message, I think, of Lag BaOmer. It's the message of our tradition at this most sacred moment. Shabbat is the day, and Shabbat is the idea and the experience and the call, the imperative, the obligation to hold both of those myrtle branches and to run with them, to skip. Afalpi, even so. So I turned to my son and I said to him, you know, there are people in the world who hate other people, and we don't know why. And we pray for them, and we pray for illumination. We pray for understanding. We pray to sit together, all people together. Those who have differences and those who don't see clearly. And we pray, I said, that each of us will respect one another. But it's a messy world, I said. It's a messy world. And I won't be able, and nor would I want to, always shelter you from that truth. We have to come out of the cave. But now that we're out, we can work to bring healing. We can work to bring understanding. We can work to bring those two things together, to run with our myrtle branches. I pray for healing for those who were hurt in Meron. And I pray for elevation of their souls as we make our way towards the Kaddish at the end of the service. And I pray for all of us, that as we too emerge from various caves, that we emerge to build a world with awareness of its messiness and our responsibility to touch that too.